So, you're wondering if you should make a Psyker? Let me show you why you should. Hello Varlets. In this video we'll go through everything you need to know about your Psyker, from understanding your role in the strike team, the kit you come with, and the feats you can change up to suit your playstyle. For those of you who are more seasoned in the game, feel free to skip towards the parts you want to watch timestamped in the description below. For the benefit of those who have not played any of Fat Shark's previous games, Vermintide The End Times and Vermintide 2, nor have any idea about anything from the Warhammer 40k universe, Psykers are essentially space wizards, and just like how wizards tend to be portrayed in any other game, Psykers have access to abilities and weapons that allow them to deal a tremendous amount of damage, whether it's against a crashing horde or a wall of elites. Depending on how you build your Psyker, the class has also some of the best crowd control capabilities in the game, neutralizing threats into nothing more than sandbags waiting for a good punch. However, just like how wizards in other games are always seen as soft and squishy, Psykers are also the weakest class among the four when it comes to their durability. Having only 100 base toughness and 150 base health, any mistakes a Psyker makes is going to be a lot more punishing, especially in the higher levels of difficulty. Before we dive into the Psyker's kit, there's one more thing that makes this class unique and a little more challenging to play than the others, and that's the Psyker's Peril resource. Peril is a resource Psykers use to fuel their abilities and force weapons. As Psykers use Peril, they don't depend on ammo or grenade caches throughout a mission. This allows your team to be more generous in dispensing the Emperor's mercy. However, if you try to cast your abilities or weapons when above 100% Peril, you will explode and either go down or die. You can avoid exploding by either letting your Peril quell naturally or by venting through pressing the reload button. With that, let's take a look at the Psyker's kit, starting with its Blitz ability, Brain Burst. Activating Brain Burst allows you to target a single enemy, marked by a bluish glowing aura, and begin channeling for about 2.5 seconds, after which you will deal heavy damage to the target depending on their armor type. On its own, Brain Burst costs 45% peril to cast and can never miss. A small tip to using Brain Burst: after acquiring a target, the channeling can be done from behind cover, letting you complete the channeling from safety. Because Brain Burst does a fixed amount of damage, its effectiveness does fall off in higher difficulties. That being said, the damage is still high enough to one-shot most elites and specials, even on Damnation difficulty, so don't count it out. When using Brain Burst, you might also be wondering, what's the point of the right click? Holding right click to activate Brain Burst, instead of using left, allows you to pre-channel the cast, letting you instant cast it when you mark a target at the cost of taking longer to charge up, and therefore costing more peril. But as the damage is the same as left clicking, you'd want to stick to using left click most of the time. Next is our aura, Kinetic Presence. Allies in Coherency gain plus 10% damage against elite enemies. Straightforward aura and affects all damage, melee, guns, staffs and abilities too. The first of the Psyker's iconic abilities is Warp Siphon. Killing an enemy with Brain Burst earns a warp charge. Each charge grants plus 3% damage and lasts for 25 seconds. At its base, you can hold up to 4 charges for a 12% increase to all outgoing damage. 12% might not seem like a lot, but in this game, a 12% damage buff can mean the difference between killing something and needing to fight on for longer because it survived with 1 health left. It's also important to know that when the 25 seconds are up, you lose all charges at once. At the same time, gaining a new charge refreshes the duration back to 25 seconds. Our last iconic ability is Battle Meditation. You have a 10% chance of quelling 10% peril on kill. This basically means that any kill from any of your attacks has a 10% chance of removing 10% of your peril, potentially letting you get an extra cast off before needing to manually quell or switch your weapons. For our combat ability, Psykers have Psykinetic's Wrath. Rapidly quell 50% peril and send out a shockwave that staggers enemies in a large cone in front of you. This ability has a 30-second cooldown, a huge area of effect that goes through walls, can be cast without disrupting your channeling, and be used in an emergency when you're about to explode from going above 100% peril. With that, our Psyker's kit is complete. Now let's see how we can change up the way your Psyker plays by going through its feats. Starting with column 1, this is where our toughness regen feats will be. For Psykers, what we choose here will depend on what type of build we're going for. The first one is Essence Harvest. Replenish 30% toughness over 5 seconds on gaining a warp charge. This is a decent choice if you have multiple ways of gaining warp charges, but on its own, the only way you'll get this feat to work is by killing things with brain bursts. This choice is usually strictly tied to certain weapons and feats. The second one is Warp Absorption. Replenish 10% toughness when you kill an enemy with a warp attack. This basically works as a form of lifesteal and is focused on keeping you in the fight, letting you take chip damage and recovering as long as you can kill. This feat is largely dependent on difficulty level and your type of playstyle. For our last feat in the toughness regen column, we have Quietude. Replenish 5% toughness for each 10% of peril quelled. This is the most flexible of the three because it allows you to control your toughness regeneration through managing your peril. And as long as you can quell peril, whether it's naturally over time or manually like using your combat ability, you'll regen toughness just the same. Quietude has the most synergy and flexibility, but it is limited on the amount of toughness it can regenerate at a time. Moving to the second column, we have Psykinetic's Wrath. I suppose this is an error on Fat Shark's part since it shares the same name as the combat ability. Never mind, we shall rename this as Psykinetic's Fury. Gain between 5% and 15% damage for your force weapon attacks based on your current level of peril. The higher your peril, the more damage you will deal with force weapons, and this feat also stacks with Warp Siphon, giving you upwards of 27% damage. Taking this feat will depend on the build and weapon you go for. The next feat is Inner Tranquility. Gain 6% peril resistance per warp charge. What this means is, the more warp charges you hold, the cheaper it is to cast your brain burst and use your force weapons, upwards of a 24% reduction in peril. Using brain burst as an example, at 0 stacks of warp charge, it costs 45% peril, but at 4 stacks, it costs about 35. This feat is overall very useful if you're going for a peril heavy build that can generate a lot of warp charges easily, and in general, you can never go wrong with reducing the peril cost of your abilities and weapons. The last feat in this column is Wrack and Ruin. Killing an elite or special with Brain Burst applies 2 stacks of Soul Blaze to all enemies within 3 meters of the target. This is a good time to explain Soul Blaze, which is essentially a stackable burn damage over time that sets enemies on fire with a bluish-white flame. At base, a Soul Blaze enemy suffers 11 ticks of damage over 8.5 seconds, and the damage it takes depends on how many stacks of Soul Blaze it suffers. Every stack of Soul Blaze also adds 1 more tick of diminishing damage, dealing 1 stack less of damage until no stacks are left. In general, anything under 4 stacks of Soul Blaze doesn't have the damage to kill anything meaningful, so it makes this feat very pointless even under extremely specific situations. Best avoid it until it's changed. Our third column is where things start to get interesting, because now we get meaningful choices that affect how we build our Psykers. In the first column, we get our first ability to gather warp charges outside of Brain Burst, Psychic Communion. Whenever you or an ally in Coherency kills an enemy, you have a 4% chance to gain a warp charge. The important feature of this feat is that it allows you to use any weapon to passively gain warp charges. This means you're no longer tied to only Brain Burst to keep your warp charges up, but also makes Essence Harvest more attractive since you have other passive ways of getting warp charges. Our second choice in this column is Psykinetic's Aura. You and allies in Coherency gain 15% combat ability cooldown on elite kill. This is a powerful team support skill that allows you and your whole team to get their abilities back up much faster and use more often. The way this ability works, if, for example, you have a veteran that gets an elite kill in Coherency with you, only the veteran will get that 15% cooldown and not you. Likewise, if you get an elite kill, only you will get the 15% cooldown. Taking this feat would depend more on your team composition, weapon choice, and the difficulty you're playing at. Finally, we have Cerebral Lacerations. Damaging an enemy with your Brain Burst causes them to take 15% damage from all non-warp sources for 5 seconds. This means your vets and their bolters, preachers with their thunder hammers, and ogrins with their box will be hitting just that much harder. This feat is really only useful on monstrosities and bosses, since most things are probably going to die way too quickly for the damage to matter anyway. In our fourth column, we have Kinetic Deflection. While below critical peril, blocking an attack causes you to gain peril instead of losing stamina. So previously, Kinetic Deflection was one of the best feats in the game for Psykers because you could block incoming melee hits practically forever with a non-force sword melee weapon because it had super fast natural quelling. This allowed you, most notably, to tank a demon host as long as you weaved in some dodging in between. However, in the recent hotfix, 1.0.22 I believe, gaining peril from blocking now pauses that natural quelling, making repeated hits gather peril until you can no longer block with it. Now, make no mistake, this feat basically gives you a second stamina bar that you can work with, allowing you to pull some clutch revives that can save a game. Next up, we have Kinetic Shield. Take between 10% and 33% reduced toughness damage from ranged attacks based on peril. While it sounds defensive in nature, this is an offensive feat that wants you to fight with your warp weapons, giving you more protection to peek and reduce the incoming chip damage while casting. Taking this feat will largely depend on your playstyle and how aggressive you like to be. In the last row, we have Mind in Motion. Movement speed is not reduced while quelling peril. Having this feat allows you to walk at full speed, not sprint, while quelling. This feat really is a quality of life upgrade that simply allows you to keep up with your team better, since as a Psyker, you tend to play in the back lines. Taking this feat can be fun for force weapon centric gameplay, as you'll be doing a lot of quelling, but it's not as strong in usefulness as the other two feats in this column. In our fifth column, we have Warp Battery. We can now store up to 6 warp charges instead of 4. This means now at 6 stacks, we have an 18% damage increase for 25 seconds with Warp Siphon. It also means we can have up to 36% peril resistance from Inner Tranquility, which is amazing on keeping up the offensive power before we need to quell. Being able to go up to 6 stacks also affects a couple of the final column feats, which I'll go over in a bit. Overall, this feat is dependent on the type of build you're looking to make work, and its value can range from being core to the build to being pointless to have. The next feat is Kinetic Overload. While at maximum warp charges, gaining a warp charge instead applies 4 stacks of Soul Blaze to a nearby enemy, prioritizing elites. While this does make the minimum 4 stacks of Soul Blaze to be useful, the problem here is that there are too many conditions attached to it for it to be of any use. First, you need to be already at maximum warp charges. Then you also need to have an enemy near enough for you to apply the Soul Blaze on, and if there are any elites near you, 4 stacks of Soul Blaze isn't going to deal any meaningful damage to them. So similar to Wrack and Ruin, this feat is just not very good and should be avoided in your build crafting. The last feat we have in this column is Kinetic Flayer. All attacks have a 10% chance on hit to cast Brain Burst on the target. This cannot occur while at critical peril and has a cooldown of 15 seconds. A 10% chance to cast a free Brain Burst every 15 seconds sounds like a pretty decent feat, especially since if the Brain Burst cast kills something, we get a warp charge out of it for no peril. This alone makes it very useful for some builds, since it gives you another way of gathering warp charges without having to depend on manually Brain Bursting to maintain your stacks. Overall, it's a very decent feat. However, the Brain Burst damage is more often than not applied to an enemy that didn't really need it, like a Poxwalker or random shooter. Our first feat in the final column is Quicken. Activating your combat ability uses up all your warp charges and reduces its cooldown based on the number of charges spent. Each charge reduces it by 12.5%, going up to 48% with base 4 warp charges and 75% with 6 warp charges from Warp Battery. At its best, this feat allows you to reduce your combat ability's cooldown to between 15 and 7.5 seconds, giving you rapid access to another cast for peril quelling, long range CC, or just to continue applying pressure with your force weapons. Useful as it may seem, this feat isn't nearly as good as the other two. Our second feat of our last column is Ascendant Blaze. Your combat ability uses up all your warp charges and applies stacks of Soul Blaze to enemies hit based on the number of warp charges expended. Enemies killed by Soul Blaze effects from any source have a 10% chance of giving you a warp charge. This feat has a lot packed into it, mechanically speaking, and will need a separate video dedicated to showing you how to really use it and the potential it holds. But for now, the main benefit of this feat is that it gives Psykers a source of massive AoE damage and another way of rapidly gathering warp charges depending on your weapon choice. Our last feat for our Psyker is Kinetic Barrage. After casting your combat ability, for the next 10 seconds, your Brain Burst charges 25% faster and uses 50% less peril to cast. This is a very powerful feat that allows Psykers to rapidly dispatch priority targets in quick succession. And this feat also gives Psykers something their kit is missing: single target DPS for monstrosities. If you want to complete both your Malleus Monstronum and Pick and Mix penances, this feat is the one you'll want to have when you're going for them. Now that we've covered the Psyker's kit and all the feats, I would be remiss as a build crafter to not offer you a build after all that. This is a universal build that you can take anywhere and will work with and independent of most loadouts. I myself bring this build into Damnation difficulty with great success, and it has not let me down yet. The focus of this build is to take out key targets as quickly as possible, while also being capable of dealing with monsters that might appear in your mission. For this, we'll take Kinetic Barrage. As Kinetic Barrage is capable of rapidly killing targets, we can very easily stack warp charges with Warp Battery, and when paired with Inner Tranquility, allows subsequent casting of either Brain Burst or Force weapons to become much cheaper. For the fourth column, I choose to take Kinetic Deflection because of the clutch potential that it holds, but if you're confident in the team and your own ability, Kinetic Shield is also a good choice in higher difficulties. For the third column, I personally take Psykinetic's Aura because rapidly killing 6 elites essentially refunds my combat ability. It's almost like having Quicken active as well. Finally, for the toughness regen feat, what I choose here would depend if I have a staff or not. If I want to play a gun Psyker, I'll take Essence Harvest. But if I have a staff to use, Quietude would be what I choose. With that, we've come to the end of a long video. I hope the information covered here has been helpful, and you now understand better how to build your Psyker, even if only a little more than before. Upcoming videos will be covering builds themed around specific weapons and other more advanced and useful Psyker mechanics. If you've enjoyed this video, consider leaving a like. Feedback and constructive criticism is welcome down below. See you in the next video. Violet.